Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. While the growth forecasts for the global economy are dipping, the outlook for the Korean economy this year is up. To find out why and the factors that could potentially turn the tide, we are joined today by Professor Sohn Sung-won of California State University. Dr. Sohn, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, we've certainly got a lot to talk about. Let's start with the Korean economy as a whole. We're nearly halfway through 2014 right now. How would you assess the current economic situation here in Korea?
It's looking better. 2013, as you know, was not the best year. And so compared to a weak year in 2014, things are looking a bit better. Of course, we had that Seoul ferry crisis, which has depressed economic conditions somewhat. But if you look at the global economy, US, Japan, and Europe, they are beginning to do a bit better than they did in 2013. So Korea is a very export-dependent economy. As a result, global economic activities are important, and I think that is positive. At the same time, as you know, the government has decided to spend more of its budget during the first half of this year compared to second half. So I'm sure that will help as well. So I'm hoping that 2014 will be a pretty decent year.
Let's look at some of the factors that are going into all of the things we're seeing in the economy right now. President Park Geun-hye is pushing this creative economy movement here, including introducing measures for deregulation, promoting SMEs, things of this sort. However, this is going to be, of course, judged on achievements. What accomplishments have we seen so far with this creative economy push?
I think it's really too early to tell. It's been less than a year since she talked seriously about the creative economy, so I think it will take some time. But the other important thing is, what do we mean by creative economy? You can have any definition you want. If you want to call it deregulation, which I think is very important, creative economy, that's fine. And then, but the way I look at it, we are really talking about more of a longer-term phenomenon. And when you talk about creative economy, we are saying, well, what about next 50 years, next 20 years, next 30 years? In the last 50 years, Korea has produced cars, ships, petrochemicals, and etc. And the economy has prospered quite well. But the problem is that we cannot really live on that for the next 50 years. We have to come up with something different. And so to me, that's where the creative economy comes in. And so I tend to look at it more of as a longer-term issue as opposed to a short-term, which will have a dramatic impact on the economy this year, next year, year after that. I don't think it will be like that.
So in the long term, then, what needs to be done right now? You mentioned deregulation. What else needs to be done right here, right now, to make sure that this creative economy does get off the ground and does meet some successful goals in the coming years?
Certainly, the role of the government is very important. But I don't really view the role of the government as, hiring people, teaching people what to do. To me, the role of the government is to create the right environment so that the private sector of the economy can create new ideas and new gadgets and then new software, things like that. And then so I think the environment is very important. Guide the economy in the right direction as opposed to telling this company what to do or telling that ministry, why don't you emphasize, this winners and that. So I don't think the role of the government is pick out really winners and losers. It is a role of the private sector to do that. And again, I think the government should create the environment such as deregulation. Also, a lot of innovations are coming from small businesses in the United States and also in Korea. So you want to make sure that we do not stifle that innovative, creative ideas through stultifying government regulations. And then so those are the kind of things that we're talking about. Now, if they do need some funding for brand new ideas, in incubators, for example, the private sector may not be willing to do that simply because the risks are too high. In that case, I think it's a role of the government to provide some funding for R&D for incubators, for example. And then so there are certain things that the government should do, but we don't want the government to do too much because I think it could interfere with the productive, creative ideas of the private sector.
There's a fine line there, is what I hear you saying.
It is,
and you talk about deregulation, there's also a fine line there as well, right? I mean, you don't want to deregulate too much, but the push right now is that we're going in that direction. What are the possible, I suppose, pitfalls of this deregulation drive? Or are there any?
Well, I am for deregulation, but at the same time, before we get into deregulation, we obviously need some regulation. You look at China, the water, air, they are polluted. Why? Because they simply didn't pay much attention in the process of promoting exports. Exports were everything, but today they realize that they are paying very, very heavy costs. So the private sector really cannot adequately account for the cost of pollution, for example. It's the role of the government to make sure that those are properly regulated, and if there is a pollution, that is properly priced, so that in the United States, for example, we are talking about the trading the pollution. There is you've got a certain limit as to how much you can pollute. If you want to pollute more, you have to buy it from someone else. And so there are ways of handling it, but certainly there needs to be some regulations. We all agree that, because again, the private sector cannot handle it very well. On the other hand, today the problem is overregulation. There are too many regulations. There have been studies which indicate that our economic growth in the United States and probably also in Korea would be higher by 1.5 to 2 percentage points in terms of GDP growth. And that may not sound like a lot, but that's a lot of economic growth. For example, in the United States, a major problem is budget deficits, right? We have $1 trillion of, this year more than $1 trillion of budget deficits. If you can give me, one higher percentage point in economic growth, we can literally wipe out that budget deficits. That's how important economic growth. And I'm saying that one of the ways of achieving that higher economic growth is through deregulation. There's just too many stultifying regulations. I mean, let me give you an example. The trains in America, all the trains must paint F in front of the train. In the old days, the reason was, you need to know which side is the front and which side is the back. Well, today we don't need that, but just one regulation which got on the books and it never went away. If you go to Bethesda, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., for children to sell lemonade, you need a permit from the city hall. I mean, that's ridiculous. And so I'm just giving you a couple of simple examples, but there are too many unnecessary, unwanted regulations which is hurting, interfering with economic growth. I talk about it in my book, but the cost of regulation in the United States is talking about literally trillions of dollars a year. And today, if we could somehow just wipe away 1/10 of the regulation that we have, we would be considerably better off. Our economy would be growing much faster. Our budget deficits would be much lower.
Looking at the Korean economy, as you mentioned before, it's heavily dependent upon exports. And in the current global environment where there is an economic downturn, that raises some concerns. What needs to be done here in Korea to stave off the effects and continue to grow?
Well, I think the president's idea about the creative economy, that is a step in the right direction. Again, I like to emphasize, to me, according to my definition, we're not talking about next 2 to 3 years, probably not during her term, but something for the next generation, for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So we need to start now, and I think that's very good. Also, she talked about deregulation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, people don't realize how expensive. I mean, we're not talking about a few $100 million. We're talking about in the U.S. Trillions of dollars in cost. In, I'm sure, Korea, maybe not trillions of dollars, but we're talking about astronomical figures. So I think President Park is focusing really on the right things. Clearly, I think one of the primary goals of any government should be job creation, and Korea is no different. But let's not forget the fact that small to medium-sized enterprises, they are the ones who create jobs. In Korea, I assume it is about 70%, it is in the United States. Many new innovations, new ideas, they come from not from big conglomerates, but from small to medium-sized enterprises. So you can see the importance. So I would say that we really need to spend more time, energy, resources, financial firepower to help out the SMEs to get the economy moving in the right direction.
Let's talk about that, because President Park has talked a lot about that, about leveling the playing field for these SMEs and maybe trying to give some more of the power to them away from the chaebol here. How do you do that? How can that effectively be done, especially in a country like Korea, which is so heavily dependent upon the chaebol?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't necessarily say we are to restrain or punish chaebols, but we should help out small to medium-sized enterprises. Let me just mention two areas. I'm a banker, and then so I spend a lot of time in finance. Financial institutions, banks in Korea and in the United States, they try to make loans to large businesses, and the large businesses, they don't need the money, so they say, no, thank you. But when you talk about small to medium-sized enterprises, they are having tough times getting loans, see, in Korea and then in the United States. So in this situation, can the government do something to encourage more lending to the SMEs? Clearly, we cannot tell banks to make bad loans. So as you know, in the United States, we have an organization called the Small Business Administration, and we have something very similar to that in Korea. I'm saying that the government can guarantee part of the loan, 70, 90% of the loans, and then the other 5, 10, 15% can be made by the private sector, the banks. So you are doing that in combination. So perhaps we can emphasize more loan guarantees from the government. Now, that is obviously going to cost money for the government, but we also have to remember that SMEs, they are the ones who create most jobs. When they create jobs, they pay taxes and then government benefits. So in the long run, I think the economy, the government would actually benefit. So more credit to the SMEs, that to me is an important area. The other sector, I think, is exports. When you talk about chaebols, for example, they manufacture, they've got production facilities overseas. They're not as affected by the strengthening value of the won. But many SMEs, they actually are engaged in exports or indirectly. And when the value of the Korean won appreciates, they get hurt because we're not exporting as much as we could. And they don't have the leeway, the flexibility the chaebols, large businesses have. And then so even in, I think, deciding what we should do, if anything, with foreign exchange, we have to take into consideration what impact does it have for SMEs. Again, they are the ones who create jobs. Most of new ideas come from SMEs.
When you look at the situation as far as foreign variables that could impact the Korean economy here in the more short term, what do you see them as being? Is it Abenomics in Japan? Is it the tapering of the U.S. stimulus measures? What do you see as being the major factor here that could, again, affect the Korean economy?
Well, all of the above, but you mentioned some of the major ones. If you look at the global economy as a kind of an ocean, one economy, whether it's Japan or Korea, we're like one boat in the middle of an ocean. So when the tide in the global ocean is moving in one direction, we really cannot, get away from the effects of that. And I think the point is that the global economy is slowing, number one, and so that affects the exports as far as Korea is concerned. Also, there are a lot of economic and political uncertainties from Eastern Europe, between China and Japan, and South America and elsewhere, that creates uncertainties, and therefore it affects the global economy and then the Korean economy as well. The value of the Korean won. Many people are concerned that maybe the Korean won is too strong. Well, I talked to some of the experts at large financial institutions in the United States and in Europe. They are saying that Korean won, that's not what I'm saying, but that's what they are saying. Today, let's say, 10, 22, 25, or to a dollar, something like that. And they are saying that pretty soon that's going to go to 9.90 and then maybe 9.85. Why? Because the Korean economy will grow faster, and inflation could be a concern. Therefore, the Bank of Korea will raise the interest rate. I'm not saying they would, but these are some of the speculations. And so most people seem to think that the Korean won will appreciate. Again, my question is, those are the external forces which are affecting the Korean economy. What, if any, could we do about it?
And you've written a book recently, New Economy, and
Yes.
in it you talk about just that. You talk about the devaluation of the Japanese yen and its effect on the Korean economy. What is that effect going to be? How do you counter what we're seeing in Japan?
Well, the Japanese economy is one thing, but first of all, let's talk about what Japan has done and its effect on the Korean economy. I'm an economist. I am a firm believer in market system, market mechanism. So if the market says this is the value of the Korean won against the Japanese yen, without any intervention, no problem. There's no right answer, the wrong answer. That is the only answer. And to some extent, I think that is the case when you talk about the value of the Korean won against the US dollar. In my book, I talked about the fact that when I wrote it a few months ago, 3-4 months ago at least, I felt that the Korean won was adequately priced in the marketplace. But I do have some concerns when it comes to the Japanese yen. Because of Abenomics, they've engaged in massive quantitative easing. Again, as a result, the value of the Japanese yen has been driven down significantly. And Korea, as you know, we compete on many fronts with the Japanese manufacturers. And again, competition is good, Japanese or otherwise. But I think they are getting some unfair competition because of what the Bank of Japan is doing. So we should ask ourselves that question. Should Korea sit back and do nothing? Yeah, that's certainly one option. The other option is using what I call open mouth policy. Rather than printing money, simply tell the market what our concerns are. Let me give you an example as to how open mouth policy, and that's kind of the term economists use.
Open mouth policy.
Yeah, open mouth policy,
Okay.
that can be very effective. In 2012, we had the financial crisis in Greece and Portugal and et cetera. They needed money. They were going to issue bonds, but no one wanted to buy. And so they were about to go bankrupt, essentially, and default on their loans. Here comes the president of European Central Bank, Mr. Draghi, and he says, if you buy Greek and Portuguese bonds, and if you don't have anybody to buy, I will buy it, don't you worry. Go ahead and buy it, because I'll guarantee it, more or less. That's what he has said. Well, the problem ended overnight, right away. And people bought Greek and the Portuguese bonds, and because they knew that if they couldn't get rid of them, they could always sell it to Mr. Draghi. And so what Mr. Draghi did was he solved the problems, and then he didn't have to buy any bonds at all, see? And so that is kind of what I call open mouth policy, and then economists use the term open mouth policy. As you know, Chairman Greenspan, he did not believe in really close communication, good communication with Wall Street, for example. So he kind of kept to himself. Mr. Bernanke was very different. He wanted to communicate. He had held the press conferences. And really the architect of what Mr. Bernanke did was a current chairwoman, Janet Yellen. She's the one who figured all that out and asked Mr. Bernanke, you do this, and then we'll be better off. I think she was right, and she is right today. And then so what I'm saying is that one of the tools that we should be using more effectively at the Bank of Korea is open mouth policy. That way you may not have to do other things, adjusting interest rates, quantitative easing, or adjusting liquidity. Use open mouth policy.
So what does that look like specifically then if the Bank of Korea were to go that route? What does that look like?
Well, I don't want to tell specifically to Bank of Korea what they should do. All I'm saying is that there's a problem. Again, one option is do nothing, which seems to be the case. And one option is use open mouth policy, and the other one is intervene in the marketplace. And I think the Korean government does that from time to time. And so, there is nothing wrong with that, assuming that they're trying to stabilize the marketplace. They can't do it too often. The next step is to cut the interest rate and provide more liquidity into the marketplace, and that will bring the value of the won. It's a matter of supply and demand. when you create more one or the dollar, the price of that one or the dollar will go down. And then so that's the last, I guess, option is quantitative easing, as the U.S. has done. But I'm not, advocating that. I don't think we need that.
Sure. You recently participated in a forum called Technology is the Future, held here in Seoul. You delivered a speech there. In the forum, you said that the future of the Korean economy will be, as you put it, technical innovation. What does that mean exactly? What does that look like?
Yes, technology, I think, is key, and Korea is really at the front, at the vanguard of technological change, and so that's why it's so important. So, but let me just give you an example. As I see it, and again, that was really the main thesis that I talked about in my book, the global economy is growing, but at a slower rate. Maybe not stagnation, but something close to that, and that is a kind of a long-term trend. I talk about many reasons why that is the case, including demographics, the aging of the society, productivity gains slowing down, fewer people in the labor force, but those are some of the reasons why the global economy is growing at a slow rate. And that certainly is true, I think, for the Korean economy as well. So then, given this slowing global economic situation, well, if the pie is not growing, the only way you can grow is getting a bigger share of the pie. And so how do you get a bigger share of the pie? I'm saying that one of the ways you can do that is use technology. And you can get ahead of, jump ahead of your competitors. And Korea is very, very good at technology. As a result, I think Korea stands a very good chance of getting a bigger slice, bigger share of the pie, which is not growing very rapidly. So in broad generality, I'm talking about importance of technology and how to talk about. In my speech, I gave actually some examples as to how people are using. We're not talking about something that we haven't thought of. We are talking about social networks. So we're talking about what others call co-creation. And so there are many things that you can do to really get a bigger share of the pie.
We're entering the second half of 2014. What's your outlook for the Korean economy over the coming months?
Again, I'm reasonably optimistic. The global economy is not growing rapidly, but doing better than it did last year. So hopefully that will improve export opportunities for the Korean economy. And again, the President Park government is doing what it can to boost economic activities. And those are a couple of the things which makes me feel that the Korean economy will do reasonably well during the second half of this year.
Dr. Sohn, you've given us a lot to think about. We appreciate you being on the show. And we, of course, encourage everybody to go out and pick up your book, New Economy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.
We will continue to do our best to improve our show based on the perspective of our viewers. Always feel free to leave us any comments, great ideas, or suggestions you wish to share with us.